Donald Trump delivering what he's calling a major economic speech. Critics say it'll kill jobs and balloon the deficit. Tonight, we'll bring on this person who'll tell us who's right. Then, Trump calls Clinton crooked Hillary. But if you look at the facts, Trump is a much bigger figure. And if you don't believe us, we got the numbers to prove it. Then, you know things are unhealthy in Washington when Congress can't even pass a clean bill to fund the fight against Zika. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Hope you had a great weekend. Thank you for joining us. Well, we begin tonight, where else, but with a race for the White House. Election Day now just 91 days away. That's just 13 weeks of campaigning left. I know what you're saying, but we are in the stretch run. Now, this weekend, I should say, not producing a lot in terms of headlines for either Trump or Clinton. But for the Donald, that means no new negative headlines, but also not a lot of positive press to help him stop his recent slide. And that slide is now confirmed by the volume of polling information we are seeing, and it's not all just attributable to the recent conventions. Now, pushing this past just that normal bump one would get from that for Hillary and into a deficit potentially, and a far more serious one for the Donald. Now let's bring in senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman, who'll break it down. It's not just the margin here, but it's why, right?
Yeah, it's some of the specifics within the polls, but let's reset this. Before the conventions, Rich, Hillary Clinton was sitting with about a 4-point lead in poll averages. And today, 2 weeks after the start of the Republican convention, Clinton's lead is up to 7.5 points. It's her biggest lead and her best individual numbers since April. The forecasters at 538 now give Clinton a 76% chance of winning the election, and if it was held today, her odds are even better, nearly 92%. That's the overview of the race, but to help get a sense of what's driving those numbers, let's dig into one specific survey, this weekend's ABC News Washington Post poll. They give Clinton an 8-point lead and put her right at 50%, but that's just when voters choose between the major party candidates. Add in third-party options, and Clinton keeps her 8-point lead, but she drops to 45%. Libertarian Gary Johnson polls 8%, and the Green Party's Jill Stein polls 4% of the vote. Any candidate needs to poll at 15% or higher to participate in the upcoming debates. So what's driving Hillary to that 8-point lead, and what danger signs should she continue to look out for? Well, let's start with unfavorable ratings. The best scores here are the lowest, and Hillary does better here to the tune of 13 points. But her negative numbers are still sitting at 50%, and if they rise, this race will tighten. No bad news for Clinton on this one, asking if the candidates are qualified to be president. Clinton scores 22 points higher than Donald Trump, who a majority of voters say is simply not qualified for the job. Finally, are the nominees honest and trustworthy? No, say the voters, and they say so in pretty equal measure. If Trump can convince voters that Clinton is not to be trusted while not hurting the way that he's viewed, this race could tighten up and tighten up quickly. Final note, with the conventions behind us, the next best way to sway large numbers of voters quickly are the debates. The first one is at Hofstra on Long Island on September 26th. And Rich, that is exactly 7 weeks from today.
That's right. And we'll have a major presence there for that evening as well. Andrew, thank you. Now, to try and close the gap, Trump today focused on the economy in what was billed as a major speech. Here are some of what he had to say.
I am proposing an across-the-board income tax reduction, especially for middle-income Americans. This will lead to millions of new and really good-paying jobs. The rich will pay their fair share, but no one will pay so much that it destroys jobs or undermines our ability as a nation to compete.
So for more on Trump's economic plan, I spoke with Politico's Isaac Arnsdorf. He covers influence and money in politics. You know, it's interesting. In many ways, if you close your eyes, some of the things you'd hear from Trump, you'd almost expect to hear from a Democratic candidate. Others more, let's say, consistent with some of the Republican ideologies. But nonetheless, child care, even lowering the corporate tax level, infrastructure spending, you know, usually don't hear that from the GOP nominee.
Well, and not to mention trade has really been probably the biggest breaking point with the Republican economic orthodoxy, and something that the business community, which is typically a major Republican ally in a presidential election year, has really been pushing back from Trump on, and you heard him hitting that message very hard again today.
The problem, though, is when you do the math, and I've heard a few folks, some of the preliminary numbers, with cutting these taxes, nothing to say of a state tax and some of the other tax regulations he'd completely get rid of entirely. You're talking in a reduction in revenues, some put it as much as $10 trillion, and that's with the T, let alone he's the same guy who wants to do all the infrastructure spending, wants to build up the military, et cetera. How does anybody think the math adds up here?
Oh, you're absolutely right. And Trump's previous tax plan was widely criticized for how much it would contribute to the deficit. That tax plan has coincidentally disappeared from his website today. And what we heard today was increasing some of the proposed tax rates, which would presumably make the overall proposal less expensive than the previous one. But we haven't seen really that same level of detail yet. And Mr. Trump promised that he would release those in the coming weeks, but it's really getting down to the wire in terms of the of Election Day compared with when you usually expect to see these kinds of policy specifics from candidates.
And Isaac, nobody could get a confused reading from this that the ones who are going to do the best are going to be the wealthiest Americans, especially when you look at here, cutting the estate tax, kind of the income tax, I guess, from 7 brackets down to 2 or 3. At the end of the day, it's curious that he chose Detroit for a setting for that. I understood what he's trying to do, but if you actually listen closely to the messaging, I'd argue this doesn't play exactly for the Motor City. Also, outsourcing could be a consequence of what I heard today.
Well, it was Detroit, but it was also the Detroit Economic Club, remember. But that's definitely true. And even the child care proposal that he mentioned today, a lot of people are pointing out is not actually likely to benefit low-income Americans as much because they probably don't have federal income taxes to deduct child care from.
And finally, I know this isn't going to be in the headlines of this, but if you believe in global warming and climate change is something that you at least acknowledge, as I guess 99 point something of the scientific community does subscribe to, he also laid out that no longer are we going to abide by some of the other agreements, but he's going to cut funding altogether for it as well.
That's right. You did hear in the same breath that he was criticizing the levels of pollution in China. He was also calling to significantly reduce regulations in the United States.
Is this going to help him, Isaac? He did stay on the prompter today. There was interrupted, I guess, 10 to a dozen times, and he managed to keep his cool. Does today help him out a lot here at the end of the day, that he sounds presidential, or does the math, the more this thing gets parsed, add up to a plan that doesn't add up?
We're definitely going to have to see in the coming days and weeks. He's got a pretty big deficit to climb back from in the latest polls, but it definitely was a contrast to see how he responded to those really persistent interruptions today compared with at some of his rallies where he's been much more combative and aggressive about wanting to kick people out or treat them harshly. And clearly some of his advisors got to him today with sticking to the script and not taking the bait.
And we shall see how long it'll last this time. Isaac, nice job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, certainly the day started off with that being the big story, the economic address. But in the last hour, a new problem for Trump. 50 big names, big Republican names who have a big problem with him. They say Donald Trump is the most reckless presidential candidate ever. And as I said, they are all Republicans. Also, it takes one to know one. Trump keeps calling Hillary a liar, but wait till you hear some of the whoppers he's told, how often he is told.